Do citizens or the citizenry have the right to a decent environment? The answer is in the affirmative, yes. Right refers to an entitlement to something recognized and protected by law, respect for which is a duty, and disregard of which is wrong. It is a just and legal claim. So apart from the section 20 of the 1999 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, with the environmental objective, in the chapter 2, that is a fundamental objective and the directive principles of state policy, there is a furtherance in chapter 4, that is under the fundamental human rights, section 33. There is a provision of the right to life. Right to life. How then does this affect the citizenry? You see, the control and regulation of the environment is therefore essential because human life and his existence is tied to his environment. Yes, as postulated by Justice Belgore, that is a justice of the Supreme Court as he was then known. You see, it was, it is a very, very clear assertion. Yes, a very clear assertion that right to life has bearing on the right to a clean and decent environment. It has been rightly argued. Yes, it has been rightly argued. So, and again, in Pakistan's case, the force of law to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was made clear. It was made clear, yes, in the UNESCO, in UNESCO, that is in the Paris Courier. You know, it was in that landmark judgment. It was stated that right to life included right to live in a clean and decent environment. Yes, you see, some jurisdictions have enshrined this to the Constitution. Yes, they have enshrined that to the Constitution. You know, but notwithstanding the fact that the provision of domestication of every convention, that the laws emanating from the conventions must be domesticated before it can be brought to life in the law of any nation. Yes, it is actually a constitutional provision in section 12, yes, of the 1999 Constitution is there. But notwithstanding constitutional rights to a different environment, that is a right to life, is fostered by decent environment, and it has been rightly argued as a human right, as a fundamental human right. So law has created a host of legal duties for federal and the state administrators, that is the environmental protection agencies, and the standards by putting some life into them, into the laws. Yes, some life has already been put into the laws provided, you know, because some ministries and departments have given us some laws, some guidelines and regulations that are adequate or partially adequate on its face value. So the standards are written in law for the administrator's duty to prevent the environment from deteriorating. This is where environmental lawsuits come in. So the offender would be liable to persons who have suffered injury as a result of the offending act. Although there are strategies for implementation of the provisions. Yes, there are strategies for implementation of the provisions. And these strategies are hinged on 5 priority areas. The first, the number 1 is the environmental legislation. Hinged on the environmental legislation, hinged on the environmental regulations, on environmental research, on environmental monitoring and evaluation, and on environmental information and awareness. And then if you look at all these, you see the roles are therefore divided. The roles are divided. For the legislation, you have the legislative bodies, and remember, sometimes lawyers also go before the legislature to review some of these laws. Then, in the area of regulation, we have the next RIA, see the National Environmental Standards and Regulation Enforcement Agency. And these are being administered, next RIA is being administered by the Ministry of Environment. And so their role is knitted under environmental regulation. And then we have the environmental research, where the universities come in, the research from the universities, the findings of research, and then the environmental monitoring and evaluation. We have the EPAs, the environmental protection agencies, and then their rules, are there, so much there, in monitoring. And then the environmental information and awareness. You see, the info is very, very important, bringing the awareness, the education to the common man, even to the grassroots, to be aware of these provisions. And so the non-governmental organizations and the community-based organizations, have a role to play in this area of environmental information and awareness. And so all federal environmental agencies and the environmental protection authorities of states are empowered to mete out criminal sanctions in environmental matters, dependent on the Attorney General of the Federation and his Ministry of Justice for prosecution. So you can see the role is divided. Yes, the role is divided. And you have the role of judiciary there, in between, and which I did mention earlier on, that the judiciary a kind of play a backup function. Therefore, there is the investigative agency enforcement policy, which is the task of next RIA. And then there is also the prosecutor agency enforcement policy, which is the Ministry of Justice, which is the role played by the Ministry of Justice and also with the police. And next we are also involved. You can see that in this area of this prosecutorial role is very, very, very important. And you look at the investigative agency, enforcement agency, and the prosecutorial agency, enforcement policy. The two are inseparable for the purpose of achieving the goals of the national policy on the environment. So the policy instruments, the laws, and the regulations have been put in place to guide the Ministry of Environment in its efforts to address environmental pollution and degradation in Nigeria. And there are policy documents on thematic areas of the ministry's mandate, such as the forests and the wildlife, drought, desertification, sanitation, solid waste management, and others.
Human relationship to its environment as regards safeguarding it is therefore not a pledging concern. It is rather an unconditional genetic mandate without which humans fail to authenticate its existence and thereby degrade human existence by negating that which enables him to survive. Until we come your way again, from me, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.